So, welcome back to the Age of Gaia. This is Kiara Windrider. And for this series, I'm going to continue with readings from the first book in the trilogy, Issa, Son of the Sun. So, here we go. So, the last week we had read chapters 1 to 5. And so we'll start this time with chapter 6. The Tuku. In the weeks to come, the travelers came back often. Their task was straightforward. One of these children was indeed a special child, a high-born teacher, a Tuku of their illumined master, the great Sakyamuni, Buddha. But which one? One day, as the children continued to mature, the eldest of the monks brought in a low stool laden with a variety of beads and malas. One of these belonged to the illumined one, he stated simply, and placed them all before the twins. If he is the incarnation of this one, he will recognize his own. Thomas opened his eyes briefly, grunted, and returned into blissful sleep. But Issa's eyes were open and bright. He gurgled with delight as his glance fixed on the elder monk. Ignoring the pile of beads on the stool, his hands reached for the simple string of beads around the elder's neck. There was a murmur of approval all around, and the old Lama beamed in wonder. A cluster of bowls was next brought in. Brass bowls and wooden bowls, big ones and little ones, shiny and dull. They were all placed in front of him in a row. Without hesitation, Issa reached over behind the intricately carved shiny brass bowls to a simple cracked begging bowl in the back, battered from years of continual use on dusty roads. Again, the chief Lama's eyes crinkled in delight, and another murmur of approval filled the room. But the third test was still to come, perhaps the most difficult of all. There are many mysteries under the sun, and not all that is known to man is composed of things visible or understood by the mind. There are pathways into the mind of the divine that sometimes go beyond human logic or comprehension. A younger Lama brought in a box containing a young dove that had been found dead in the fields earlier that morning. He offered the box to the elder Lama, who placed the bird directly in front of Issa. A light seemed to fill the room as a higher presence overlighted the young child's form. As he placed his hands lightly on the vacated form of the dove, a strange electrical sensation filled the room. A mist seemed to pass through the air as the little dove fluttered to life, circled the room 3 times, and flew away into the open sky. Issa had passed each test he had been given. Jubilantly, the Lamas bowed low before the newborn child and his parents, and traced their way back towards the foothills of the Himalayas, so they could share the good news that the Bodhisattva had indeed reincarnated in a human body. Chapter 7, Iskandariya. Shortly after Issa and Thomas were born, Yusuf and Maryam, along with her mother, Anna, left for the land of Egypt. They spent some time at the Asen monastery in Qumran along the way, which had links with the Buddhist monasteries back in Kashmir, and then on to Iskandariya, near the mouth of the Nile, where they were awaited among the Essenes of that region. Anna's younger sister, Elizabeth, had found her way to this Essene community with her infant son, Johann. After her husband died in the green valleys of their Kashmiri homeland. And so it was natural that the newly arrived family chose to move there as well. Iskandria was a port city on the southern borders of the Mediterranean. It was a major crossing point along the trade routes that flowed east and west, and also across the sea into Rome, Gaul, Graecia, Britannia, Ephesus, and Anatolia. There was a large Asen community here on the shoreline of Lake Mareotis, whose members numbered around 4,000, consisting of healers and scholars who were dedicated to the ways of truth in simplicity and brotherly love. The members of this community carried no private possessions, and everything they had was shared in common. Yusuf had already donated a portion of the gold received by the lamas and wise men to the community in Qumran, and now gave away whatever remained to the Essenes in Iskandaria. It was a large amount and ensured that the community would be taken care of in times to come. For themselves and their future needs, he trusted that the same spirit that had carried them so far would continue supporting them wherever they needed to be. The principles followed by the Essenes were indeed very similar to Buddhist monasteries founded in India. Like the Buddhists, the Essenes were a monastic community of men and women who were dedicated to perfecting themselves as best they could through prayer, fasting, and contemplation on the mysteries of nature. They practiced communal living, where each member was committed to the well-being of everyone else. Men and women had equal status. Children were few and were raised in the ways of sobriety and self-inquiry. Sexual abstinence or moderation was encouraged so that the life energies could be channeled towards the goal of self-realization. All life was revered. Animals were considered sacred, and so their flesh was not consumed. The arts of healing were widely investigated and practiced. The Essenes were masters of natural medicine and used the elements of earth, water, wind, fire, and ether for healing, along with fasting, herbs, fragrances, oils, and the laying on of hands. They worked not just with the elements themselves, but with the subtle forces or angels behind physical matter. The higher elemental powers were personified and worshipped as archangels. Archangel Michael, for instance, represented the fiery forces of justice and truth. Archangel Jibril represented the gentle breeze of divine inspiration, while Archangel Raphael was the force behind the healing fountains that sourced the elixir of life. Essene brotherhoods had held strong ties with the Buddhist monasteries ever since the days of King Ashoka in India. The story goes that after a particularly bloody battle where he had decimated the prince of Kalinga in the pursuit of expanding his empire, Ashoka had woken up to the horror and devastation of war and vowed never to fight again. He had become a Buddhist and offered the vast wealth of his kingdom to the cause of Buddhism in order to spread the teachings of peace, compassion, and self-liberation throughout the known world. And so Buddhist missionaries of that day had joined merchants along the trade routes all the way up into the empires of China and Japan, and all the way westward into Egypt, wherever fertile soil was found. The Essenes also called themselves therapeutes after the Theravada tradition of monastic Buddhism, which also gives rise to the term therapy or healing. And so it was that among the Essenes, Issa the Tulku started to receive the training he needed for the work that lay ahead. The first few years of life are the most pivotal and will shape the patterns of thought and deed for all time. It was here that Issa learned about the use of medicinal plants, lotions, and potions for strengthening the nerves and immune system, the use of mud, flame, and flowing water for drawing out toxins, about the use of breath in controlling one's life energies, and laying on hands for healing. In the purity of life among the Essenes, he developed a strength of body and sharpness of mind that allowed the vastness of his spirit to be anchored deeply into his physical being. During his years in Iskandria, Issa became closely acquainted with his cousin, Johann. They were often together, both deeply inspired by something beyond the physical worlds that was making itself felt and visible in all the worlds of form. As with Johann, Issa's already sensitive soul became deeply committed to the ways of compassion, brotherhood, and healing. And it was from early on that he already knew that his life would be dedicated in the service of life. There was a place where God and nature and mankind could meet. And Issa and Johann both knew this was to be their mission, to create a world as best they could, where man lived with nature and God lived with man. Chapter 8, Galilee. There had been among the Essenes of Iskandria for 7 years. Herodes the Great had died during this time, and Yusuf felt it safe now to move his family back to Palestine in the region of Galilee. This was the land of the Yehudi, consisting of the tribes of Yehuda and Benjamin. Although the Kashmiri tribes are sometimes referred to as Yehudis as well, they preferred to call themselves the Beni Israel, the sons of Israel, for they consisted of the 10 tribes who had been relocated there from Samaria during the conquest of the Assyrians. It was ironic that there was still so much enmity between the Yehudis and the Israelites. The Yehudis did not acknowledge the Beni Israel as sharing the same lineage with their forefathers, and preferred to think they had somehow been wiped off the face of the earth during one of the forced migrations. They referred to the Kashmiris as the lost tribes. Meanwhile, the Beni Israel of Kashmir referred to the Palestinian Yehudis as the lost sheep, since they seemed to have strayed into difficult times as a colonized nation, oppressed by the Roman conquerors, and equally suppressed by the priestly castes of Pharisees and Sadducees. Nevertheless, although they had become accustomed to their life among the Essenes and felt at home among these simple and beautiful people, it was to Palestine that the lamas from the east had told him he must go. For this is where Issa needed to acquaint himself with the common Yehudi people in order to fulfill his future mission. They moved to the little town called Nazareth. Life in Palestine was different, fast-paced, competitive, and fraught with political intrigue. Issa missed his playmate Johann, who had remained in Iskandria with the Essenes. And he did not understand why the children here in Nazareth could be so uncaring and cruel. His Kashmiri blue eyes and wheat-colored hair set him apart, and he felt himself being ostracized for looking different, acting different, and being different. Issa began spending time among those whom society had cast out as well. He was being called Yeshua now, which is the Yehudi interpretation of the Kashmiri Issa. Along with his mother, he would often go out to the leper colony on the outskirts of town, often taking along some loaves of freshly baked bread and staying behind to share a meal or converse with them. Children born to lepers were considered unclean as well. And while Mariam spent time ministering to some of the adults, Issa would spend time with the children in the canyons, playing games of hide and seek, swimming in tiny water holes, or simply exploring the desert mysteries. One of his favorite playmates was Hannah. Her mother had died a few years after her own birth, and she had been raised by her father, a grisly-looking former zealot who had been wounded during one of their constant skirmishes with the Roman legions. When his wounds failed to heal and became infected, he had been forced out into the outskirts. The so-called leper colony was thus a community of outcasts who formed their own community and learned to care for one another. Hannah and Issa would often spend time together, playing in the mud near the water holes when it rained. Sometimes they would fashion birds, animals, and people out of clay and pretend to breathe life into them. They were startled once when a flock of doves swooped down over them, just as Issa passed his breath over a clay pigeon. Perhaps the dove had become a symbol for his Atma, just as he was being tested by the lamas from Tibet. Anna excitedly told the others what she had seen, and soon a legend had grown around him that he could breathe life into the dead. His serious demeanor, exotic looks, and the mysterious sense of destiny that people felt in his presence added to the legend. He taught Hannah and the other children what he had learned from the Essenes about a father who watched over all his children equally and who made no distinction between rich and poor, male and female, leper and whole. It was a comforting message for these outcasts among men. But already at this tender age, the word was getting around town that he was a troublemaker and consorted with the outcast and unclean. Meanwhile, Yusuf and Maryam taught him what they knew about the journeys of his people through the steppes of Asia into the valleys of Kashmir, stories of the Buddha, legends of the Prophet Musa, and how his people had finally arrived in the promised land of milk and honey, the land of green valleys and the profusion of wildflowers. They told him stories of kings and yogis in the Himalayan mountains and how one day they would go back there. Occasionally, Issa's uncle, Gondaforus, would come by from Gandhara and began taking Issa, along with his brothers, on his journeys into Britannia, where he had been trading in tin. The coast of Cornwall was dotted with mines, and he became quite prosperous as a tin merchant. He was known there as Harimatheus, the Just. The wild Cornish coast, with its bracing windy climate, was a sharp contrast to the often harsh deserts of their adopted homeland, and they often journeyed here from the ports of Iskandria, from where he would send the supplies of tin through the overland trade routes back to Gandhara and Kashmir. Chapter 9, Jerusalem. On the day of his 12th birthday, His parents took Issa to the temple in Jerusalem. He had been looking forward to this visit for months. It was his first visit to Jerusalem, and he felt suitably awed to see the scale and architectural grandeur of this great temple. But he felt discomforted as well. Why don't I feel the divine presence here? He asked his mother. I feel the Spirit of God more in the desert valleys and more in the simple traditions of our Asen brothers than I do here. Mariam did not argue with her son, for she too felt the same ostentatious display of wealth and piety here, devoid of genuine humility and heart. It had become a bustling marketplace of religion, with hawkers peddling doves, goats, and other animals for sacrificial offerings. Pilgrims coming to the temple would purchase what they could afford and then offer these protesting animals to the priests, who would then sacrifice them to the God of the Yehudis, Yahweh, in restitution for sins. It was a bit too much for the young and sensitive Issa. Why does God want the blood of innocent animals to pay for someone else's sins? He demanded of Mariam. How can there be justice in this? Mariam tried to tell him about the sacrifice made by the forefather, Ibrahim, who sacrificed a goat instead of his firstborn son. But that didn't really answer his question. So why did God want Ibrahim to sacrifice his son? What kind of God does that make him? Mariam told him he was only testing his obedience. Issa didn't see the point of that either. So why would he lie to Ibrahim then? And then he asked her pointedly, would you let Abba kill me if God said he must? Mariam smiled. She saw that Issa was not going to give up and knew he could have argued all day to find answers she did not have either. Why don't you go find a priest you can pester, she told him, and pointed him to the chambers adjacent to the main temple, where he would be sure to find one. He found the high priest of the temple in Jerusalem, Ezra. Issa immediately accosted him with the same question. Why does God need sacrifices of blood? He asked, point blank. The head priest was a kindly man and recognized the sensitivity and sincerity of the young lad. Come, sit with me, he invited Issa. Your question is not about sacrifices, but about the nature of God, isn't it? True, said Issa. I've felt God in the wind. I feel him in the desert sands. God is a feeling of fullness and joy when I know I can help and serve those that I meet. How do I serve God by sacrificing a life that he himself created? How does that make God happy? Ezra was taken aback by the question, and not just the question, but by the passion and power he felt flowing from this young lad. Most people were satisfied with being told what to believe and did not dare question the authority of the priesthood. He admired the sincerity of this young lad's heart and the depth of intuitive understanding that prompted these questions. And there was a light of purity that blazed in his eyes, a light that Ezra acknowledged with respect. It had been a long time since he had met somebody like Issa. He did not answer immediately. What's your name, lad? Ezra finally asked him. My name is Issa, was the response, although they call me Yeshua here in this land. Issa, said Ezra, I'm guessing you've spent some time among the Asen brotherhoods, or you would not be asking these questions. You are right. There is a great difference between my human concepts and ideas of God. at the majesty of God Himself as the name that cannot be named. You're absolutely correct in saying that the nameless God has no need for blood sacrifices, nor does He find these endless rituals necessarily pleasing. So how do I find this nameless God then? Asked Issa. Ezra paused, breathing deeply as he looked into Issa's eyes. Not everyone is as innocent as you are, young Issa. His eyes grew moist. He was remembering his own days as a young boy when the same light had burned in his own soul. He had been troubled by the same questions he learned later to suppress and ignore in order to pass his studies as a rabbi. And then he got older, and with age came positions of leadership and responsibility. He had become jaded and had learned to interpret accurately the letter of the law rather than be moved by his spirit. And now here was this 12-year-old lad shining the light of purity into all the choices and decisions he had made in his 70 years of life. Ezra was humble enough to know when to feel humbled, knowing he had seen in the eyes of Issa the reflection of his own forgotten soul. My dear son, he finally responded, I do not have a good answer to your question, but I can tell you this is the most important question of your life. Do not be satisfied with answers that scratch the surface, answers that seek to comfort with half-truths. You are destined for more than that. Your heart is pure and will guide you. When you ask the right questions, the answers will no longer come in words or concepts. Once you learn to ask the right questions, nothing will be hidden from you. He embraced Issa and blessed him. Go, my son, he said. Our little world here is too small for the spirit that moves through you. Go eastwards, he prophesied, for that is where your destiny lies. Learn all you can. One day you will come back here. Teach me then, if I still live, of what you will find among the learned ones of the East. What he did not tell the young Issa was that he had recognized in him the Messiah that the Yehudi people had awaited for long centuries. It was enough to know that he had come. Ezra felt a profound joy sweeping through his body. He could die in peace now. Chapter 10. The Journey Back. Issa and his family remained in Jerusalem for 3 days, with Issa spending as much time with Ezra as he could. A bond of love and respect had grown between them, and Issa shared with Ezra also about the journeys he had made a few months ago with his uncle, Yusuf, into the lands of Gaul and Britannia, and the circles of stone he had seen there, and the altars to the great goddess, which had moved him so much. Why do you call him father? He asked Ezra once, when he is also equally the mother, the birther of all life. As the boy enthusiastically shared the gist of these conversations with Yusuf and Maryam on the way home, they realized that the time had come to return to the East. They remembered also what the Lamas had told them when Issa was born, that they would await his coming when the time was right, so he could learn from them what he needed in order to fulfill his destiny as the Messiah. They made preparations for the long journey. There were 2 primary routes connecting east and west. The Silk Road was the northern route, which started from Iskandria and went east through Damascus, Baghdad, and Tehran, and then through Kabul and the Punjab, out through Kashmir to China. The spice road went as far as Persia, and then continued across the Arabian Sea by boat to the Malabar coast of South India. Caravans of camels and ponies and ships plied these routes all the time. It normally takes 3 or 4 months of travel for a caravan to cover the distance between Palestine and Kashmir. But Yusuf and Maryam wanted to stop at various places along the way. They would simply join a caravan, travel as far as they wished, stay where needed, and then continue on with the next available caravan until they arrived home in Kashmir. The family, which included by now a new arrival, Yusuf, started with a brief visit to the Asen community in Iskandria, where they were reunited with their relatives, Anna, Elizabeth, and Johann. Issa was delighted to see Johann again, whom he had missed greatly, and Maryam was happy to spend some time with her aunt and mother. A few months later, it was time to move on. Maryam wanted to visit the land of their origins, up in the Chaldean region of Urfa, where their forefather, Ibrahim, had been born in the city of Ur. They passed the ruins of the ancient city of Gobekli Tepe, whose age was lost in antiquity, but estimated at least 10,000 years old, before even the days of Nuh. They then traveled northeast up through Damascus to Nasibim, on the eastern border of Anatolia, close to the Caspian Sea, where her Tocharian ancestors had originated. From Nasibim, they continued on southeast, a short distance, into the kingdom of Persia, where they were awaited. The people of Palestine were on good terms with the Parsis. After Cyrus the Great routed the Babylonians, who had conquered Palestine several hundred years back, he had allowed the Yehudis to resettle in the region and opened trade routes between the two nations. The Parsis were now alerted to the arrival of the travelers. Prince Saraim came rushing out to meet them as they entered the borders of Persia. It had been 13 years ago that he had traveled out with Gondophares and Balthazar from Gandhara for the birth of Issa, and he was overjoyed to see them again, and especially to meet Issa, who was now growing into manhood. Saraim insisted that they stay with him for some time, welcoming the family with great pomp and ceremony. He took it upon himself to instruct Issa in the history, culture, and religion of that period. The lad was struck by the opulence and glory of the Parsi civilization, the likes of which he had not seen in all his journeys so far. He was impressed by the generous hospitality of the people, the refinement of their culture and education, their inventiveness. The cities were constructed with an eye for both beauty and practicality. Truly, he thought, if there ever was a heaven on earth, this was it. Saraim also instructed him in the religious traditions of his people. Their prophet, Zarathustra, had been born in that region about 1500 years ago, which was about the same time that the prophet Musa had departed from Egypt with the Hebrews and began wandering through the deserts. Like Musa, Zarathustra believed that there was only one God, whom he called Ahura Mazda, who embodied all the qualities of Asha, or light. He did not know what to do with the problem of evil, however, and therefore assigned everything that was true or false to an entity known as Ahriman, similar to what the Yehudis called Satan. Issa was, as always, ready with his questions. Was he saying that Ahura Mazda and Ahriman were equal in power? Yes, the universe is held in perfect balance between these two forces, said our prophet. The forces of good and the forces of evil are always struggling with each other for dominance. So then that means there cannot be just one God, but two, countered Issa. If the forces of evil are equal in power, then the struggle between good and evil is eternal. How does anyone know who will win? And how can anyone know peace? You're right, young man. Sarai was pleased to see how perceptively his mind worked. Most people do believe that, yes, and live their lives in fear of being overtaken by evil. But perhaps it depends on our definition of evil. Evil implies that something is wrong with the universe. But how can this be if Asha fills everything and all is Asha? So maybe it isn't something out there which is wrong, but something inside us, inquired Issa. Yes, there is that doctrine as well. And some believe that we are born flawed and therefore need to be saved from what they call original sin. But that too implies there is something wrong with God's universe. And how can that be if Asha is everything and flows through everything, including ourselves? Think on this, Issa. I'm not going to take away your own moment of truth by trying to give you easy answers. Just keep asking the right questions, and the doors of discovery will be opened to you. Perhaps it is not a question of making premature judgments of what is good and what is evil, or even who is good and who is evil, which is the cause of most wars and conflicts in this world, but rather asking yourself, what is the nature of evil in this world? And what does this tell us about the truth of who we are? Sarai knew that in order to truly bear fruit, the answers must be found within. His role was simply to plant the seed and trust that someday this would grow into a mighty tree of life. He saw that Issa's intellect was keen and his spirit fiery and strong, and nodded in satisfaction. There were prophecies in the Parsi tradition about the sun behind the sun, and he had hoped this boy would manifest this divine sun in fulfillment of the prophecies. He offered a prayer of thanks to Ahura Mazda. The time has come, he breathed, for all things to return again to light. And he thanked the holy Asha for choosing him to play a role, however small, so that the sun of the sun could shine more brightly. Issa and his family remained in Persia as guests of Sarayan for some time. It was an opportunity for him to learn about the arts and culture of this magnificent land and people. He also spent some time with Sarayan and the court astrologers, learning about cycles of time and how all things moved according to a preordained destiny, a cosmic order, which was predictable for one who had the skill and sensitivity to read the pattern in the stars, planets, and cosmos. All right, so that's the end of the readings for today, and we'll continue on next week. Thank you for watching. If you're interested, please check out Amazon, which um, has printed copies of the first two books of this trilogy available: Issa, Son of the Sun, and Miran, Daughter of the Moon. The third book in the trilogy is almost complete and should be out on the market fairly soon. So thank you for joining me here. Please continue to check out other channels on the Conscious Awakening Network, and we'll see you soon. Blessings.